There is a moment when emotional intelligence stops being a gift and becomes a mirror. A person walks into your life and something feels different. They do not flatter you. They do not chase your approval. They do not perform vulnerability to make you feel important. They simply stand in front of you as they are, and somehow that honesty creates more tension than manipulation ever did. For a person who has spent years reading emotions, anticipating reactions, and protecting themselves from hidden motives, authenticity can be strangely uncomfortable. Not because authenticity is dangerous, but because it leaves very little to decode. There is no mask to study, no contradiction to expose, no emotional game to win. And this is where the idea of the dangerous empath becomes interesting. The dangerous empath, as a psychological storytelling concept, is not dangerous because they possess some supernatural ability. Their danger comes from something much more human: awareness. They notice patterns. They recognize emotional shifts. They can sense when someone's words and behavior do not match. They understand the difference between genuine vulnerability and vulnerability being used as a weapon. But there is another level beyond simply noticing people. The Sophia stage can be understood symbolically as a stage of wisdom, discernment, and psychological maturity. It represents the point where an empath no longer wants to understand everyone simply so they can rescue them, fix them, or remain connected to them. They want to understand reality, and reality is not always comfortable. This distinction matters because an empath who has not developed boundaries may absorb everything around them. They feel another person's sadness and immediately try to carry it. They sense someone's anger and begin wondering what they did wrong. They notice rejection and rush to repair the relationship. Their empathy becomes a doorway through which other people's emotions constantly enter. But psychological maturity changes the direction of that energy. The mature empath begins asking a different question. Not, how can I make this person feel better? But, what is actually happening here? That question can change an entire relationship, because once you stop reacting to emotional intensity loses some of its power over you. This is where Carl Jung's ideas become useful. Jung explored the unconscious, the shadow, projection, and the process of individuation. His work repeatedly returned to the idea that psychological development requires us to become more conscious of what is happening inside us, not just what we want people to see, not just what we believe about ourselves, but also the parts we would rather avoid: the anger, the jealousy, the fear, the need for approval, the desire to control, the fear of abandonment, the hidden wish to be needed. An empath can spend years studying everyone else's emotions while avoiding their own shadow. And that creates a strange contradiction. They may understand everyone except themselves. The Sophia stage, in this symbolic sense, begins when that contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. The empath stops using sensitivity as an excuse to avoid truth. They begin looking inward. And that is precisely why authenticity can become such a powerful encounter. An authentic person does not give the empath endless emotional material to analyze. They do not constantly create confusion. They do not require the empath to rescue them from themselves. They simply communicate. I am angry. I do not agree. I need space. I care about you, but I cannot do this. There is something almost unsettling about that kind of honesty, especially for someone accustomed to hidden meanings, because authenticity removes the psychological fog. And when the fog disappears, the empath is forced to face something deeper. Perhaps the problem was never that other people were impossible to understand. Perhaps the problem was that the empath had become addicted to understanding them. There is a subtle difference. One creates wisdom. The other creates exhaustion. A person can become so skilled at reading emotional environments that they forget they are allowed to exist without constantly monitoring those environments. They walk into a room and immediately notice who is uncomfortable. They hear a change in someone's voice. They recognize the tension behind a smile. They detect the hesitation before an answer. These abilities can be valuable, but if they become compulsive, they can turn into hypervigilance rather than wisdom. The mature empath learns the difference. They can notice without absorbing. They can understand without rescuing. They can care without surrendering themselves. And they can see someone's darkness without making it their responsibility. That is where the phrase dangerous empath takes on a deeper meaning. The danger is not that they become cruel. The danger is that they become difficult to control through emotional pressure. Guilt does not work as easily. False urgency does not work as easily. Emotional chaos does not automatically pull them into action. They begin watching behavior over promises, consistency over intensity, truth over performance, and then something unexpected happens. The people around them begin reacting to the change. Some become healthier because the empath's new boundaries create a more honest relationship. Others become uncomfortable because the old version of the empath was easier to influence. And sometimes, the most revealing reaction comes from the person who is genuinely authentic, because authenticity does not try to control the empath's boundaries, it respects them. That becomes the real test. Can the empath remain open without becoming vulnerable to manipulation? Can they remain discerning without becoming suspicious of everyone? Can they encounter an honest person without searching for a hidden agenda? Can they allow someone to simply be real? This is where the Sophia stage becomes more than a dramatic label. It becomes a psychological question. What happens when a person who has spent years reading everyone else finally encounters someone who has nothing to hide? The answer is not always immediate. Sometimes the first reaction is discomfort, then curiosity, then recognition, and eventually something deeper, the realization that authenticity does not require constant analysis, it requires presence. And that lesson becomes the beginning of everything that follows. The transformation of an empath rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It usually begins quietly. A conversation ends differently. A boundary is finally respected. A familiar form of manipulation suddenly stops working. The empath notices that they are no longer desperate to explain themselves. And then they realize something that would have seemed impossible years earlier. They can walk away without hatred. That is a major psychological shift. Many people think emotional strength means becoming colder. They imagine that the only way to protect yourself is to stop caring. But that is not psychological maturity. Emotional maturity is not the absence of feeling. It is the ability to feel without becoming controlled by what you feel. This distinction is especially important when discussing the concept of a dangerous empath. A reactive empath experiences another person's emotion and immediately responds to it. Someone is angry, so they become anxious. Someone withdraws, so they chase. Someone cries, so they abandon their own position. Someone becomes disappointed, so they feel guilty. Their emotional state becomes dependent on the emotional atmosphere around them. But a psychologically mature empath develops an internal pause. They notice the emotion, they identify it, and then they decide what to do. That pause may last only a few seconds, but psychologically, it creates an enormous difference. It separates awareness from reaction. Carl Jung's concept of individuation offers a useful way to understand this development. Individuation was not about becoming perfect. It involved becoming more fully conscious of oneself and integrating different parts of the personality. For an empath, this means recognizing that compassion and boundaries do not contradict each other. You can understand someone and still disagree with them. You can forgive someone and still refuse access to your life. You can recognize someone's trauma without allowing that trauma to justify harmful behavior. You can love someone without becoming responsible for their emotional stability. These are difficult lessons because many empaths confuse compassion with responsibility. They think, if I understand why they behave this way, I should tolerate it. But understanding is not permission. Knowing the reason behind someone's behavior does not erase its consequences. This is where authenticity becomes powerful again. An authentic person does not need you to abandon your boundaries to prove that you care. They may be disappointed by your boundary. They may even disagree with it, but they can communicate honestly. That creates something very different from manipulation. Imagine an empath telling someone, I cannot talk about this tonight. I need some space. A manipulative response might be, so you obviously do not care about me. An authentic response might be, I am disappointed, but I understand. Let's talk tomorrow. The difference is not subtle. One creates guilt, the other creates communication. The mature empath begins recognizing this distinction, and once they do, their relationships begin changing. They stop measuring closeness by emotional intensity. This is important because intensity is often mistaken for intimacy. A relationship filled with dramatic arguments, sudden reconciliations, emotional confessions, jealousy, and fear can feel incredibly powerful. But power is not the same as health. Sometimes the quietest relationship is the deepest one. There is no constant emotional emergency, no need to prove love every few hours, no endless guessing, no punishment for needing space. There is simply consistency. For someone who has spent years surviving emotional unpredictability, consistency can initially feel boring. That is another psychological trap. Chaos can become familiar. Peace can feel unfamiliar. And when peace feels unfamiliar, A person may unconsciously create problems simply because their nervous system recognizes conflict more easily than calm. The Sophia stage, as a symbolic framework, represents the point where the empath begins questioning these patterns. Why am I attracted to people I have to rescue? Why does emotional distance make me chase? Why do I feel responsible for someone's mood? Why do I interpret someone's silence as rejection? Why do I feel valuable only when someone needs me? These questions are uncomfortable because they shift responsibility inward. It is easier to say, everyone around me is toxic. It is harder to ask, why do I repeatedly remain in relationships where I am treated this way? That does not mean the empath is responsible for another person's manipulation. It means they are responsible for understanding their own patterns. And that is a major difference. The mature empath does not blame themselves for being mistreated. They learn from the pattern. They begin noticing early warning signs. They stop explaining away inconsistencies. They listen when their body tells them something feels wrong. But they also avoid the opposite extreme. Because psychological growth can create another danger. Hypervigilance can disguise itself as intuition. A person who has been betrayed may begin assuming betrayal everywhere. A person who has experienced manipulation may begin interpreting every disagreement as manipulation. A person who has learned to recognize hidden motives may become obsessed with finding hidden motives. That is not wisdom. That is fear wearing the clothing of wisdom. The mature empath learns to say, I notice something feels unusual, but I do not need to decide what it means yet. That sentence contains enormous psychological strength. It allows uncertainty. And uncertainty is something emotionally reactive people often struggle to tolerate. They want immediate answers. They want to know who is good and who is bad. They want to know whether someone is genuine or fake. But human beings are more complicated than that. Someone can be loving and still selfish. Someone can be wounded and still responsible for their behavior. Someone can make a mistake without being manipulative. Someone can be authentic and still have flaws. The mature empath accepts this complexity. That is why their perception becomes sharper. They stop looking for perfect categories. They start observing patterns. And this is where the transformation becomes visible. They no longer need to win every emotional battle. They no longer need everyone to understand them. They no longer need to prove that they were right. Their energy becomes quieter, but their boundaries become stronger. And that combination is often what people interpret as dangerous. Because someone who is calm and deeply observant is difficult to pull into unnecessary chaos. They do not have to raise their voice. They do not have to threaten. They simply stop participating. And sometimes that silence communicates more than an argument ever could. But there is still another layer, because becoming aware of other people's behavior is only half of psychological development. Eventually, the empath has to meet the part of themselves they have been avoiding, their own shadow. And that encounter can be far more uncomfortable than confronting another person's darkness. The most dangerous person is not always the one who understands darkness. Sometimes it is the person who refuses to admit that darkness exists within them. This is where Jung's concept of the shadow becomes particularly relevant. The shadow can be understood as the collection of qualities, impulses, emotions, and tendencies that the conscious personality does not easily accept. It does not simply mean evil. It can contain anger, ambition, jealousy, selfishness, sexual desire, need for recognition, the wish to control. Even healthy qualities that a person was taught to suppress. An empath may have a particularly complicated relationship with the shadow. Why? Because many empaths build their identity around being understanding, kind, patient, forgiving, and emotionally available. Those qualities can be genuine, but when they become an identity that must never be challenged, they can create repression. The empath may secretly feel anger, but refuse to acknowledge it. They may resent someone but tell themselves they are simply being compassionate. They may want recognition but feel ashamed of wanting it. They may desire control but disguise it as concern. And when an emotion is denied consciously, it does not necessarily disappear. It may emerge indirectly. That is why psychological integration matters. The goal is not to become emotionless. The goal is to become honest about what exists inside you. A mature empath can say, I am angry, without immediately becoming aggressive. I am jealous, without allowing jealousy to control their behavior. I want this person's approval, without pretending they do not. I want to walk away, without inventing a moral reason to justify it. This is a different kind of strength. It is the strength of psychological honesty. Jung also explored projection. the tendency to attribute parts of ourselves that we have not recognized to other people. This can happen in relationships constantly. A person who refuses to acknowledge their own need for control may become obsessed with controlling people. Someone who denies their own jealousy may accuse everyone else of being jealous. Someone who fears rejection may interpret neutral behavior as rejection. The empath is not immune to this. In fact, deep sensitivity can sometimes make projection more complicated. Because the empath notices so much emotional information, they may become extremely confident in their interpretations. But perception is not the same as certainty. You can sense tension without knowing its cause. You can notice someone's hesitation without knowing what they are thinking. You can feel that something is wrong without knowing exactly what is wrong. This is why authenticity becomes such a powerful teacher. An authentic person can interrupt the empath's assumptions. The empath may think, "They are pulling away because they are angry with me." And the authentic person says, "No, I have had a difficult day. It has nothing to do with you." Suddenly, the empath discovers that their perception was real, but their interpretation was incomplete. That distinction is incredibly important. Emotional sensitivity gives you information. It does not automatically give you the full story. The Sophia stage, symbolically understood, is where the empath learns to respect that difference. They stop treating every feeling as a fact. They stop treating every intuition as a prophecy. They stop treating every uncomfortable sensation as evidence of betrayal. Instead, they become curious. What else could explain this? That question protects them from becoming prisoners of their own perception. And yet, there is another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the empath's sensitivity is not only used to protect themselves, it can also be used to influence others. A person who knows exactly what someone fears may know exactly what to say. A person who understands emotional wounds may know how to trigger them. A person who can read vulnerability can potentially exploit vulnerability. That is why the concept of the dangerous empath should not be romanticized. Psychological awareness does not automatically make someone morally good. Knowledge is neutral. What matters is how it is used. A person can understand another's emotional weakness and use that understanding to protect them, or they can use it to control them. The mature empath recognizes this responsibility. They do not weaponize psychological knowledge. They do not deliberately trigger insecurities to gain power. They do not expose someone's private pain simply because they know where it exists. Their strength is restraint. This is another reason authenticity matters. Authenticity forces the empath to examine their own motives. Why do I want to know this person's weakness? Why do I feel powerful when I understand them better than they understand themselves? Why do I enjoy being the person who can predict everyone? Why do I feel safe only when I have psychological information about another person? These questions reveal something deeper. Sometimes the desire to understand people is actually a desire to control uncertainty. If I can predict you, I feel safe. If I know what you will do, I cannot be surprised. If I understand your patterns, I cannot be betrayed. But life does not offer that kind of certainty. People change, people surprise us, people make mistakes. Even someone who has been authentic for years can have a difficult day. Psychological maturity requires accepting uncertainty without surrendering discernment. That balance is difficult. Too little awareness, and you become easily manipulated. Too much suspicion, and you become isolated. Too much empathy, and you lose yourself. Too little empathy, and you lose your humanity. The Sophia stage represents the middle path. Not blindness, not paranoia, discernment. And discernment does something fascinating. It allows the empath to see another person's shadow without immediately becoming afraid of it. They understand that everyone has contradictions. Everyone has insecurity. Everyone has impulses they do not always express. The goal is not to find someone without a shadow. The goal is to find someone who is willing to take responsibility for theirs. That is the real test of authenticity, not perfection, responsibility. A person who can say, "I was wrong." A person who can apologize without turning the apology into another manipulation. A person who can admit fear without using fear to control you. A person who can receive a boundary without punishing you for having one. This kind of person does something remarkable to the mature empath. They make vigilance unnecessary. And when vigilance disappears, something inside the empath finally becomes quiet. But not everyone welcomes that quiet. Some relationships depend on the empath remaining confused. And when confusion disappears, the relationship itself may begin to change. That is where power, manipulation, and emotional dynamics become impossible to ignore. Every relationship contains influence. We affect each other through words, attention, affection, disappointment, silence, and expectations. But influence becomes manipulation when one person deliberately uses another person's emotional vulnerabilities to control their choices. For an empath, this distinction can be difficult because empathy naturally creates a desire to understand, and manipulative people often know how to use that desire. They may present themselves as deeply wounded. They may constantly need reassurance. They may turn every boundary into evidence of rejection. They may create emotional emergencies. They may become extremely affectionate after hurting someone, then distant when the other person asks for accountability. The cycle creates confusion, and confusion is often where manipulation thrives. A person who is confused spends more energy analyzing than deciding. They ask, "Did I misunderstand? Maybe they did not mean it. Maybe they are just hurt. Maybe I should give them another chance. Maybe I am being too sensitive." This is where the mature empath begins doing something different. They stop analyzing isolated moments. They observe patterns. One bad day does not define a person. One mistake does not prove manipulation. But repeated behavior tells a different story. If someone repeatedly violates boundaries, apologizes, becomes affectionate, and then repeats the same behavior, the pattern matters more than the apology. This is not about labeling people as narcissists or villains. It is about recognizing behavior. And behavioral awareness is one of the most important forms of psychological self-protection. Consider a simple example. An empath says, "I cannot answer your calls late at night." The other person responds, "Fine. I guess I am not important to you." The empath feels guilty. In the past, they might immediately call back, but now they pause. They recognize the emotional pressure. They do not attack the person. They do not become cold. They simply repeat the boundary. "I understand that you feel disappointed, but my boundary remains the same." That sentence is powerful because it separates empathy from surrender. "I understand how you feel" does not mean, "I will do whatever you want." This is one of the biggest psychological changes in a mature empath. They learn that another person's feelings are real without automatically becoming their responsibility. That can transform every relationship. In romantic relationships, it means love no longer requires constant emotional availability. In friendships, it means friendship does not require unlimited access. In family relationships, it means history does not erase boundaries. And in toxic relationships, it can mean the end of a cycle. But there is something else that happens. The people around the empath begin noticing that the old emotional shortcuts no longer work. Guilt becomes less effective. Pressure becomes less effective. Silent treatment becomes less effective. Urgency becomes less effective. And sometimes the other person escalates. This is where the situation can become psychologically intense. When a familiar strategy stops producing the expected response, the person using it may try harder. They may accuse. They may become dramatic. They may suddenly become extremely loving. They may remind the empath of everything they have ever done for them. They may say, "After everything I have done for you." The mature empath listens, but they do not automatically surrender. They understand something important. A favor is not a contract for lifelong emotional obedience. Love is not debt. And guilt is not proof of wrongdoing. This is not cruelty. It is differentiation. Jung's psychological framework places importance on becoming a distinct individual rather than living entirely through the expectations of others. For the empath, differentiation can feel almost like betrayal at first. They may think, "If I choose myself, am I becoming selfish?" But there is a difference between selfishness and self-respect. Selfishness says, "My needs matter, yours do not." Self-respect says, "Your needs matter, and mine matter too." That balance is essential. And this is where authenticity becomes the opposite of manipulation. An authentic person can tell you what they want without pretending you are morally obligated to give it to them. They can be disappointed without punishing you. They can disagree without trying to destroy your sense of self. They can say, "I do not like your decision, but I respect your right to make it." That is emotional adulthood. And when a dangerous empath encounters that kind of person, something unusual happens. The empath has nothing to fight. There is no hidden game, no emotional trap, no constant need to defend themselves. The relationship becomes almost boring in the healthiest possible way. There is space, there is honesty, there is disagreement without destruction. And this can force the empath to confront another question. If I no longer have to protect myself from manipulation, who am I when I am simply being myself? That question can be surprisingly difficult. Because some people become so accustomed to surviving unhealthy relationships that survival becomes part of their identity. They become the protector, the analyzer, the rescuer. The person who sees what everyone else misses. But if nobody needs rescuing, what remains? The answer is not emptiness, it is freedom. The empath begins discovering interests that have nothing to do with healing other people. They develop opinions without checking whether everyone approves. They experience silence without assuming something is wrong. They spend time alone without interpreting solitude as rejection. They become less interested in being needed and more interested in being known. This is a profound transformation. But it often comes with loss. Some people will not accept the new version of the empath. Some relationships will weaken. Some people will accuse them of changing. And they are right. The empath has changed. But change is not always betrayal. Sometimes change is evidence that a person finally stopped abandoning themselves. That realization leads to the point of no return. The moment when the empath understands that they cannot return to the person they used to be simply to keep someone else comfortable. And once that happens, the relationship with power changes forever. There is a moment in psychological growth when something inside you becomes irreversible. You may still feel fear. You may still miss people. You may still become emotional. But you can no longer unknow what you have learned. The empath reaches a point where they recognize the difference between love and attachment, compassion and responsibility, intuition and fear, authenticity and performance. After that, certain behaviors simply look different. The same message that once created panic may now look like pressure. The same apology that once felt romantic may now look incomplete. The same silence that once made you chase may now feel like information. This does not mean the empath becomes emotionally numb. It means their emotions no longer automatically make decisions for them. That is the point of no return. They can still care. But they no longer confuse caring with surrender. They can still forgive. But they no longer confuse forgiveness with access. They can still love, but they no longer confuse love with self-abandonment. This is where the idea of the dangerous empath becomes most powerful as a metaphor. A person who once reacted immediately now pauses. A person who once explained everything now chooses carefully. A person who once chased closure begins creating closure internally. A person who once needed everyone to understand them realizes that understanding is not always available. And strangely, the less they need from other people emotionally, the more authentic their relationships become. Because they are no longer negotiating from fear. They are not thinking, if I disagree, they might leave. They are thinking, if we cannot disagree honestly, then something important is already missing. That is freedom. But freedom can frighten people who benefited from dependence. Imagine someone who always answered your messages immediately. You became accustomed to that access. Then one day they stop, not because they hate you, not because they want revenge. They simply have a life. At first, you may think something is wrong, but nothing is wrong. They have developed a boundary. That small change can reveal the entire structure of a relationship. Healthy people adjust. Manipulative dynamics often resist. This is why boundaries are so psychologically revealing. They do not create someone's character, they reveal it. Tell a respectful person no, and they may be disappointed, but they remain respectful. Tell a controlling person no, and suddenly you become selfish, cold, ungrateful, difficult, or cruel. The boundary did not create the reaction. It exposed what was already there. The mature empath learns to observe that reaction without becoming consumed by it. This is not always easy. Empaths often carry enormous guilt. They may know intellectually that they are allowed to say no, yet still feel terrible when someone is disappointed. This is where emotional maturity becomes a practice. You can feel guilty and still keep your boundary. You can feel afraid and still tell the truth. You can miss someone and still refuse to return to an unhealthy relationship. Feelings do not always require action. That sentence is simple, but it can change a person's life. Feeling guilty does not mean you did something wrong. Feeling anxious does not mean you are unsafe. Feeling responsible does not mean you are responsible. Feeling love does not mean you must stay. This is where the mature empath begins separating emotional information from emotional commands. And that distinction creates enormous internal freedom. It also changes how they experience authenticity. Before this transformation, authenticity may have seemed threatening because it removed the empath's ability to predict. After the transformation, authenticity becomes a relief. An authentic person does not require the empath to constantly decode them. If they are upset, they can say so. If they need space, they can communicate it. If they disagree, they do not need to disguise it. If they make a mistake, they can admit it. This creates a relationship where the empath can finally put down the psychological microscope. They can simply be present, and that is one of the deepest forms of intimacy, not knowing everything about someone, but trusting that you can ask. There is a major difference between certainty and trust. Certainty says, I know exactly what you are thinking. Trust says, I may not know what you are thinking, but I believe we can communicate honestly. The second is healthier. It also requires humility. The empath must accept that they can be wrong. That may be difficult for someone who has survived by reading people. When your intuition has protected you repeatedly, it is tempting to believe every feeling is accurate. But mature intuition includes the ability to question itself. That is not weakness. It is sophistication. The empath becomes capable of saying, this is what I sense, but I will wait for evidence. That one habit can prevent enormous emotional mistakes. It prevents suspicion from becoming certainty. It prevents fear from becoming accusation. It prevents sensitivity from becoming paranoia. And it makes the empath more grounded. At this stage, the person may appear very different to those who knew them before. They may seem quieter, more selective, less reactive, less interested in explaining. Some people may call them cold. Others may say they have changed. They have. But the change is not the disappearance of empathy. It is the removal of emotional dependency from empathy. They no longer need to absorb another person's pain to prove that they care. They no longer need to suffer alongside someone to demonstrate compassion. They can stand beside another person's pain without becoming swallowed by it. That is emotional strength. And perhaps the most important change is this. They stop asking, how can I make this person choose me? They begin asking, is this relationship capable of meeting me in truth? That is a completely different question. It changes who they allow into their lives. It changes what they tolerate. It changes what they call love. And eventually, it changes how they understand themselves. This is where the symbolic Sophia stage reaches its deepest meaning. Not a supernatural transformation, not a secret level of human evolution, but a movement toward wisdom, a movement toward psychological integration, a movement toward becoming someone who can hold compassion and boundaries at the same time. And that is exactly where Jung's ideas about individuation become especially relevant, because becoming whole does not mean becoming perfect. It means becoming more conscious, more honest, more responsible for your own inner world, and less dependent on controlling the outer world. The empath no longer needs everyone to be predictable. They simply need themselves to remain grounded. That is the real point of no return. Once you learn how to remain yourself in the presence of someone else's emotions, you become much harder to manipulate. But you also become much more capable of genuine intimacy. And that is the paradox. The stronger the boundary becomes, the more authentic the connection can become. The word Sophia is traditionally associated with wisdom. In the framework of this discussion, the Sophia stage should not be treated as a recognized scientific or clinical stage. It is better understood as a symbolic idea, the movement from emotional sensitivity toward wisdom, discernment, integration, and conscious self-knowledge. And that distinction matters, because psychological growth is not about unlocking a secret identity. It is about becoming more honest about the person you already are. The immature empath may believe, I feel everything, therefore I understand everything. The mature empath learns, I feel deeply, but I still need to question my interpretation. That is wisdom. The immature empath may say, I know they are hurting, so I must save them. The mature empath says, I can understand their pain without taking responsibility for their choices. That is wisdom. The immature empath may believe, if I love someone enough, they will change. The mature empath understands, people change when they choose to change. That is wisdom. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this. You can recognize someone's potential without becoming responsible for fulfilling it. This is where authenticity becomes central. An authentic person does not require you to imagine who they could become. They show you who they are. That can be confronting. Because many relationships survive through potential. We could be happy. They could change. Deep down, they really care. Once they heal, everything will be different. But authenticity brings attention back to the present. Who is this person now? How do they behave now? How do they treat you now? What happens when you say no? What happens when you disagree? What happens when they are frustrated? These questions reveal more than promises. Jung's concept of individuation can again help explain the process. Individuation involves moving toward a more complete relationship with the total personality, including aspects that the conscious ego would rather avoid. For an empath, that can mean letting go of the identity of the good one. This can be surprisingly difficult, because being good can become a psychological prison when it means never being angry, never saying no, never disappointing anyone, and never prioritizing yourself. A whole person is not always agreeable. A whole person has boundaries. A whole person can disappoint others. A whole person can say no. A whole person can walk away. A whole person can admit, I do not like this. I am hurt. I am angry. I made a mistake. I need help. I cannot help you. That last sentence may be one of the hardest for an empath to say. I cannot help you. Not because they do not care, but because they recognize the limits of their responsibility. This is the shadow becoming conscious. The empath stops pretending to be endlessly patient. They stop pretending that every person deserves unlimited chances. They stop pretending that compassion requires self-destruction, and something beautiful happens. Their kindness becomes more authentic because it is no longer forced. They help because they choose to help. They listen because they want to listen. They forgive because they have processed what happened. They give without secretly expecting recognition. That is very different from being the person who constantly sacrifices themselves and then quietly resents everyone for accepting the sacrifice. The mature empath does not make invisible contracts, they communicate. And this is why authenticity can be so transformative. An authentic person allows the empath to practice being real. If the empath says, I do not have the emotional capacity for this today, and the other person responds with understanding, the empath learns that boundaries do not automatically destroy relationships. If the empath says, that hurt me, and the other person listens instead of attacking, the empath learns that vulnerability does not always lead to punishment. If the empath disagrees and the relationship survives, the empath learns that connection does not require sameness. These experiences slowly reshape the nervous system's expectations. The world becomes less dangerous, not because everyone has become safe, but because the empath has become better equipped to respond. That is an important distinction. Psychological maturity does not create a world without manipulation. It creates a person who recognizes manipulation without losing themselves inside it. It does not eliminate difficult people. It improves discernment. It does not guarantee that nobody will betray you. It teaches you that betrayal does not have to destroy your identity. It does not make pain disappear. It changes your relationship with pain. This is why the Sophia stage can be understood as a symbolic movement from emotional absorption toward conscious participation. You still feel, but you choose, you still care. But you discern, you still love, but you remain yourself. And authenticity becomes the final test, because it is easy to be authentic when nobody disagrees with you. The real test comes when another person's truth challenges your own. Can you listen without becoming defensive? Can you admit that you were wrong? Can you remain connected without controlling the outcome? Can you allow someone to be different from you? That is psychological maturity. And sometimes the authentic person becomes a mirror. They show the empath where they are still pretending. Perhaps the empath says they want honesty but becomes uncomfortable when someone gives it. Perhaps they claim they want boundaries but feel rejected when someone establishes one. Perhaps they say they want healthy love but secretly miss emotional intensity. The authentic person reveals these contradictions without necessarily trying to. That is why authenticity can feel uncomfortable. It removes excuses. There is nowhere to hide behind psychological analysis. You cannot keep saying, I understand people, while refusing to understand yourself. You cannot keep diagnosing everyone else while ignoring your own patterns. You cannot keep calling yourself compassionate while secretly using compassion to avoid confrontation. The Sophia stage, at its deepest symbolic level, is therefore not about becoming more powerful than others. It is about becoming less divided within yourself. The empath integrates sensitivity with strength, compassion with boundaries, intuition with reason, emotion with reflection, the shadow with consciousness. And when these parts begin working together, something changes. The person no longer needs to be dangerous. They become grounded. They do not need to dominate a room. They do not need to expose everyone. They do not need revenge. They do not need to prove that they can see through people. They simply see, and then they choose. That is a much quieter kind of power. And perhaps the most surprising part is what happens next. The empath begins discovering that authenticity was never the enemy. It was the invitation. An invitation to stop performing, to stop rescuing, to stop predicting, to stop absorbing, and finally, to become present. The deepest transformation of an empath is not becoming harder. It is becoming clearer. At the beginning, the empath may believe their greatest strength is their ability to feel what others feel. Later, they discover that their real strength is knowing what belongs to them and what does not. That distinction changes everything. Another person's anger may belong to them. Another person's disappointment may belong to them. Another person's insecurity may belong to them. Another person's choices may belong to them. The empath can care, but they do not have to carry. That is the final lesson hidden inside the idea of the dangerous empath encountering authenticity in the Sophia stage. The encounter is not really about two people. It is about what happens when perception meets truth. The empath has spent years learning to detect what is hidden. Then they meet someone who does not hide. At first, this may feel strangely unfamiliar. There is no emotional puzzle, no confusing contradiction, no performance to decode. The person simply says what they mean, and suddenly the empath has to face the possibility that they do not need to be constantly vigilant. They can relax, they can listen, they can trust slowly. They can allow another person to explain themselves instead of assuming they already know. This is where emotional intelligence becomes something deeper than sensitivity. It becomes humility. The mature empath knows, I may sense something, but I can still be wrong. That sentence protects them from arrogance, because there is a subtle danger in becoming good at reading people. You can begin believing that your interpretation is always correct. You can start seeing hidden motives everywhere. You can become addicted to psychological analysis. Everyone becomes a case study. Every conversation becomes evidence. Every silence becomes a message. Every change in tone becomes a clue. Eventually, the empath is no longer living. They are investigating. And no human being can build intimacy from permanent investigation. Authenticity breaks that pattern, because authentic relationships invite direct communication. Instead of, what do you think they really meant? You can ask, what did you mean? Instead of, why are they acting differently? You can ask, is something wrong? Instead of, I know they are angry, you can say, I sense some tension. Do you want to talk about it? This movement from assumption to communication is one of the clearest signs of psychological maturity, and it changes the meaning of intuition. Intuition is no longer used as a weapon. It becomes an invitation to pay attention. That is all. You notice. You remain curious. You verify. Then you decide. This is what separates discernment from paranoia. And it is also what separates psychological awareness from emotional manipulation. A truly mature empath does not use someone's vulnerabilities against them. They understand that seeing another person's weakness is not permission to exploit it. In fact, the more they understand human psychology, the more responsible they become with that understanding. They know where to stop. They know when silence is wiser than exposure. They know when confrontation is necessary. They know when distance is healthier. And they know that revenge usually keeps a person psychologically connected to the very person they claim to have escaped. This is why the strongest response is sometimes no response. Not because silence is always powerful, but because not every situation deserves your emotional participation. There are people you will never convince. There are people who will misunderstand you. There are people who will rewrite the story. There are people who will remember only the version that protects their ego. The mature empath eventually accepts this. They stop trying to control the narrative inside someone else's mind. That is freedom. And this is where the Sophia stage becomes meaningful as a symbolic idea. Wisdom is not knowing everything. Wisdom is knowing what you do not need to know. You do not need to know why someone betrayed you before deciding that betrayal is unacceptable. You do not need to know every detail behind someone's behavior before creating distance. You do not need someone's confession to validate your experience. You do not need revenge to prove that you were hurt. And you do not need another person's approval to know who you are. This is the point where the dangerous empath becomes something different. Not dangerous because they can destroy people. Dangerous because emotional chaos no longer has automatic access to them. They can be kind without being controllable. They can be loving without being dependent. They can be sensitive without being fragile. They can be perceptive without becoming paranoid. They can forgive without forgetting. They can walk away without hatred. And perhaps most importantly, they can encounter authenticity without trying to dissect it. They can simply meet another human being. That may sound ordinary, But for someone who has spent years surviving emotional complexity, it is extraordinary because authenticity does not ask you to perform. It does not require you to be the healer. It does not require you to be the strongest person in the room. It does not require you to understand everything. It simply asks you to be real. And sometimes, the most profound psychological healing begins when you realize that you are allowed to do exactly that. No performance, no rescue mission, no emotional debt, no endless analysis, just truth. Carl Jung's psychological work can be read as an invitation toward greater consciousness, not as a promise of perfection. The same principle applies here. The goal is not to become someone who can read every person. The goal is to become someone who can read themselves honestly, to recognize your shadow without becoming ashamed of it, to recognize your sensitivity without being ruled by it, to recognize your wounds without making them your identity, to recognize your boundaries without apologizing for having them, and to recognize another person's authenticity without assuming that you must protect yourself from it. Because the final paradox is this: the empath becomes strongest, not when they stop feeling, but when they stop being controlled by what they feel. They become wiser, not when they understand everyone, but when they understand the limits of their own understanding. And they become free not when nobody can hurt them, but when another person's behavior can no longer determine who they are. That is the deeper meaning behind the encounter. Authenticity does not defeat the empath, it reveals them. It reveals whether their empathy is rooted in fear or wisdom, whether their intuition is grounded or reactive, whether their kindness comes from freedom or the need to be needed, whether their boundaries are real or merely another form of control. And when the empath can stand before an authentic person, without needing to dominate, rescue, decode, or escape, something important has happened. The emotional armor becomes unnecessary. The shadow becomes less frightening. The need for control begins to disappear, and the person discovers a quieter form of power, the power to remain themselves. That may be the real Sophia stage, not a supernatural evolution, not a secret psychological rank, but a symbolic image of what happens when empathy becomes conscious, when sensitivity gains boundaries, when intuition gains humility, when compassion gains discernment, when the shadow becomes something to understand rather than something to deny, and when authenticity is no longer perceived as a threat, but as a mirror, because in the end, the most important person the empath must learn to see clearly is not the person standing across from them. It is the person standing in the mirror. And once that person becomes familiar, the world becomes much easier to navigate, not because the world becomes less complicated, but because you finally stop losing yourself inside its complexity. That is the real transformation. And that is why the most powerful empath is not the one who can see through everyone. It is the one who no longer needs to.